And here we are beginning part 4. It turns out I have to make 4 videos for this week. So let's pick up right where we left off. We're walking through Hume's famous problem of induction. On page 15, he says, to the question, what is the nature of all our reasonings concerning matter of fact? The proper answer, he says, seems to be that they are based on the relation of cause and effect. So this is a rehearsal of the issue we just walked through. When it is further asked, what is the foundation of all our reasonings about cause and effect? We answer in one word, experience. But if we persist with questions and ask, what are inferences from experiences based on? This raises a new question that may be harder still. Right? So without any difficulty, again, I see a fire, I infer that it would burn me if I were to touch it. That's not under question from Hume. We do that all the time. It's a part of our natural constitution. The question is, on what basis do we proceed through the world? Do we navigate the world with confidence on the basis of what experience opens up in terms of how we grasp and make sense of that which is presently outside of our experience? So for instance, he uses the example of bread. You see a loaf of bread and you intuit immediately, even if you're not hungry, even if you're not thinking of this consciously, that the bread would nourish you. It would be a source of nutrition. Now, this is, of course, the 18th century. We no longer really think of bread as nutritious, but replace that with, I don't know, an eggplant. You see an eggplant, you think, yes, I've never eaten this specific eggplant, but because I have familiarity with other eggplants and I have some understanding, Harry, stop! And I have some understanding of their nutritional content, I'm confident that I could eat this and first of all, it won't kill me, and secondly, it'll be good for me. But how do I do that? Well, I have this feeling, like I just said, that the future tends to resemble the past. And scholars refer to this as the principle of the uniformity of nature, right? So the principle of the uniformity of nature says precisely that all things being equal, given similar effects which appear similar, we can infer similar causes. So all things being equal, the future does tend to resemble the past. So we rely on this medium that brings into contact to allow us to make certain inferences, inductive inferences. So using the small sample of our present impressions and our past experience, we determine something about a greater population or about what is not yet apparent for us in our present opening to the world, so the future, in other words. Well, how do we go about doing that? There is this medium that brings together our present perception of something and that which is not in our present understanding or consciousness. And this medium is the principle of the uniformity of nature. But how reliable is this principle and where does it come from? So if Hume is right that all our knowledge of phenomena in the world issues either from relations of ideas, which are necessary, that is apodictically certain, knowable a priori, cannot be conceived of without contradiction, or is it through matters of fact, which are about real material occurrences in the world, but we can never achieve complete certainty of them, and these facts are only knowable a posteriori. So if these are the only pathways through which we come to develop knowledge, where do we get our reliance on this principle of the uniformity of nature? That is, that the future does tend to resemble the past, and therefore our experience can be seen as a trustworthy guide for that which is not presently in our experience. Well, where do we get it? And so on page 15, he says, despite this ignorance of natural powers and forces, however, we always assume that the same sensible qualities will have the same secret powers, so those hidden causes. For instance, you can't just look at a loaf of bread and determine its nutritional content. It requires experience of it. And we expect them to have the same effects that we have found them to have in our past experience. Okay, so far so good. A little bit down the page. All that past experience can tell us directly and for sure concerns the behavior of the particular objects we observed at the particular time when we observed them. My experience directly and certainly informs me that that fire consumed coal then, but it's silent about the behavior of the same fire a few minutes later and about other fires at any time. Why should this experience be extended to future times and to other objects, which for all we know, may only seem similar? Well, where do we get it? Is it then a relation of ideas? So can we know with absolutely unshakable certainty that the future will, in fact, in all cases, resemble our past experience, making that past experience, again, a reliable guide for our future? Could it be a priori? Well, he says on page 16 that no demonstrative arguments are involved in the inference from past to future seems evident, since there is no outright contradiction in supposing that the course of nature will change so that an object that seems like ones we have experienced will have different or contrary effects from theirs. So I can conceive of happening upon some phenomenon which seems to me visually to be a fire, but when I touch it, it feels cold. I can imagine that. I can conceive of it without contradiction. So in matters of fact, every contrary to a given truth, which is verified by my experience or someone else's, is conceivable. So a sentence like, my cell phone is on the table. It might be, in fact, presently on the table as I just put it there. But, of course, it's not being on the table is easily acceptable to my thinking, right? It's something, okay, now it's not on the table. The contrary of a particular fact is always conceivable. It's conceivable that grass might be pink, that clouds might be solid to the touch. I can imagine that. Of course, in that experience, as it appeared or occurred, it would be quite surprising. But I can conceive of these things without contradiction. So in the same way, I can conceive of a world in which the future, even if it's surprising, does not resemble the past. Therefore, we don't know that experience is reliable in the way it shows us cause and effect relationships. We don't know that it's an experience that experience is a helpful guide necessarily for the future, even if nature, that is human nature, the way we are set up psychologically to navigate the world, nature will always intervene and constrain our behaviors and shape our beliefs in such a way that we have no power to control or alter these things out of our mere volition or will. Right? He goes on to say, but probable reasoning, if I have described it accurately, can't provide us with the argument we are looking for. So probable reasoning, inductive reasoning, that is reasoning about matters of fact, or as he also puts it, real existence. So we've already excluded relations of ideas as a source of knowledge of the principle of the uniformity of nature. So maybe we get it from matters of fact. But he says, probable reasoning, if I have described it accurately, can't provide us with the argument we are looking for. According to my account, all arguments about existence are based on the relation of cause and effect. Our knowledge of that relation is derived entirely from experience. And in drawing conclusions from experience, we assume that the future will be like the past. So if we try to prove this assumption, namely that the future will be like the past, by probable arguments, so arguments taken up from matters of fact, that is, arguments regarding existence, we shall obviously be going in a circle, taking for granted the very point that is in question. We would be engaged in circular reasoning. So I depicted the issue for us graphically here. So how do we determine the truth based on experience of things that we encounter in the world? For example, that fire, which you infer immediately will be hot if you were to get close enough to touch it, although it's not yet available. So through matters of fact or real existence. So when we make determinations of matter of fact, we do that through recognizing a cause and effect relationship. So I look at the fire, I say, flame causes heat. So I would experience that unpleasant effect if I were to throw myself into the fire. Okay, so far so good. Cause and effect. How do I make determinations of that nature? Well, through experience. So from causes which appear similar, we expect similar effects. Experience or experiments, like a scientist conducts in a laboratory. So because I have had prior familiarity with the phenomenon of flame, I, based on that experience, recognize that flame causes heat as its effect, okay? So I move from matters of fact to cause and effect to then experience. But now the question is, how do I recognize the content of my own past experience in the capacity as a legitimate, that is, reliable and helpful guide for future experiences, at this point, future possible experiences? Well, there's that principle, which is presupposed, it's assumed, it's taken for granted and never explicitly interrogated. I take for granted, that is, that the future tends to resemble the past. So now the question is, where do I get that knowledge? We've already shown it can't be through relations of ideas, because I can conceive of a world in which the future does not resemble the past. If I say it derives from matters of fact, here you go. I have now arrived for my conclusion right at the very beginning. That is the first premise of my argument. I'm arguing in a circle, right? So where does this bring Hume in his conclusion? Well, the conclusion is, we think that nature tends to behave in this way, that our experience can guide us to truths about possible experiences or about what is yet unclear in our projections towards the future. We do this because of nature itself. We can't even stop it if we were to want it. So because of my past experience, my consciousness, my understanding of reality is severely determined and constrained in such a way that I carry various beliefs about the world, and I have no direct control over the character of those beliefs. My experience produces those beliefs in me, and there's nothing I can do about it. So I can't look at that fire and think, oh no, it wouldn't burn me, because my experience has told me otherwise. And even if abstractly I want to carry out this weird skeptical argument and say, oh, well, maybe if I were to touch the flame, it would feel like jello in my hand. I can play around in that way. But when the moment comes for me to actually touch it, most likely, unless I'm insane or drunk or something, I'm not going to do it because my experience prohibits that belief. So although it's no more rational, because none of this is grounded in rationality, a priori reasoning. It's no more rational for you to think that when you finally get to, get in your car and drive somewhere again, your car will not have transformed overnight into an enormous beetle and flown away. It's no more rational for you to believe that your car is not doing that. It's actually sitting right there where you left it. You can't force yourself to believe that your car will transform itself into a beetle. But you have no rationally grounded certainty of what to expect in the future, even if your experience has shaped your expectations in that way. So then we know about the future on the basis of our experience because of inferences about cause and effect. And we take, if we want experimental science, which relies on cause and effect relationships, we want that to be certain. that is rationally grounded. And so we want to think that cause and effect is characterized by a necessary connection, but in fact, it's just a constant conjunction.